The buzz inside Atlanta Hartsfield International Airport was hectic as usual. Passengers shuffled past, wrestling with overstuffed suitcases while flight announcements echoed through the high ceilings. The sound of hurried footsteps filled the air, creating a familiar rhythm against the polished floors. Camilla Johnson maneuvered gracefully through the crowded terminal. She wore a simple gray hoodie, jeans, and sneakers, effortlessly blending into the sea of travelers, quite different from the high-powered executive she typically embodied. Usually she stood out in her tailored suits, commanding respect with her presence. But today she found solace in the anonymity, enjoying the freedom that came with it. After years of dedication to shaping Skywing's Airlines into a top player in the industry, she was now confronting an unsettling reality. Discontent was growing, with allegations of mistreatment and a culture that seemed to judge passengers based on their appearances surfacing in whispers. Despite poring over numerous reports and analyzing the data, she understood that statistics could never really tell the full story. She needed first-hand insight. Approaching the Skywing's check-in counter, she took a moment to absorb the scene around her. The line moved at a snail's pace, but it was more than just a simple delay. It revealed a troubling hierarchy in service, dictated by a traveler's perceived status. Camilla observed a sharply dressed man in a navy suit being greeted warmly by a blonde attendant, while a weary older Latina woman in front of her received nothing more than a curt nod and an irritated sigh. A deep breath escaped her. Perhaps it was wishful thinking, but she had clung to the belief that the rumors were overstated. Drawing closer, she noticed the man behind the counter barely acknowledged her presence. His name tag read Mark Davidson, a man in his early 30s with a chiseled jaw and an air of nonchalance. With his arms crossed, he projected a vibe of detachment, as if already poised to overlook her. "Next," he called out, glancing down at his paperwork. Camilla nodded politely. "Good morning. I just wanted to—" she began. "Are you checking in or not?" he interrupted, not bothering to look up. She raised an eyebrow at his brusque tone. "I'm not here to check in. I was just observing," she replied. Mark released an exaggerated sigh. "Ma'am, this counter is for passengers only. If you're lost, I suggest you ask security." "I'm not lost," Camilla responded evenly. "I was actually—" Mark turned his head, already waving to the next person in line. "Step aside so I can help actual customers." The term stung more than it should have. Actual customers. Camilla tightened her jaw, willing herself to remain composed. She wouldn't let her emotions take over just yet. "Excuse me," she stated, this time projecting confidence. "I think you should hear me out." Mark finally met her gaze, and for a fleeting moment she detected a mixture of annoyance and something deeper, a silent understanding hanging in the air. It was the look people wore when they thought someone was out of place. "Look," he said, his voice laced with impatience, "I don't know what you're doing here, but we don't allow loitering at the counter. Either you have a ticket, or you need to move along." Camilla could feel the weight of the stares from the passengers behind her. Some watched with mild curiosity, while others found it amusing. No one stepped up to defend her. Breathing in slowly, she steadied herself. "Is there a problem here?" A new voice broke into the mix. Camilla turned and saw Susan Reynolds, the check-in supervisor, approaching with purpose. Susan, a middle-aged woman with sharp features and short platinum blonde hair, radiated the confidence of someone accustomed to being in control. "Not a problem," Mark said, smirking. "Just someone hanging around where she shouldn't be." Camilla held Susan's gaze firmly. "I was simply observing how customers are treated." Susan's lips tightened into a thin line. "And why should that concern you?" Camilla thought. "Because it's my company." But she held her tongue for now. Susan crossed her arms. "If you're not a passenger, you shouldn't be here. I'll have to ask you to leave." There was no hint of hesitation, no room for consideration, just a swift dismissal. Camilla's fingers twitched. She wasn't sure what irked her more, their condescension or the assumption that she didn't belong. "I'm not bothering anyone," Camilla replied, her voice steady. "I just wanted to—" Susan's expression hardened. "If you don't have a ticket, I will call security." A few passengers exchanged looks. Some pulled out their phones, sensing some entertainment about to unfold. Camilla tilted her head, incredulous. "You'd really call security on me? For just standing here?" Susan didn't waver. "Yes." Mark, feeling emboldened, reached for the phone. "I'll call them now?" Their certainty was striking. There was no doubt in their minds that they were in the right. No second-guessing, no hesitation. Camilla stared at them, feeling a chill run through her. She had anticipated witnessing discrimination, but experiencing it up close was unsettling. It didn't matter that she had built this company from the ground up or that she had invested years into developing its policies, hiring its staff, and driving its success. All they saw was a black woman in everyday clothes, standing in what they assumed was an inappropriate place. Mark calmly spoke into the phone. "We have a situation at the Skywings counter. Someone stood her ground, refusing to back down, as if she were a threat." Camilla sensed the weight of every gaze in the terminal. Whispers floated through the air and stares bore into her. A few faces smirked, clearly entertained by the unfolding. Sure drama. Just then, the police arrived. 2 officers approached her, their expressions unreadable. The murmurs from the crowd intensified. Some passengers took cautious steps back, as if bracing for trouble. A tall officer with salt and pepper hair stepped forward. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us." Flanking him were Susan and Mark, arms crossed, wearing smug expressions. Camilla drew a slow breath. She could end it all with one simple statement. But she held back. Instead, she reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and dialed a number. Moments later, her voice was steady as she uttered 3 simple words. "I want everyone here. Now." She tucked the phone away and offered Mark and Susan a small, knowing smile. She could already envision the moment when their confidence would morph into dread, and she was prepared to wait for it. 7 minutes. Time stretched as the airport buzzed around her. The 2 officers remained steadfast, awaiting her compliance. Meanwhile, Susan and Mark wore expressions of triumph, convinced this was over. Camilla stood still, her hands relaxed at her sides. She had no intention of resisting, no need for it. She knew this game well and exactly how it would play out. Mark cleared his throat, shifting his weight with impatience. "Ma'am, the officers asked you to come with them." Camilla met his gaze, her expression inscrutable. "I heard them." She noticed the flicker of irritation cross his face, his lips pressing together at her calmness. He had expected protest, panic, anything to validate their actions, but Camilla had no intention of providing that satisfaction. Susan huffed loudly. "This is ridiculous. She's wasting everyone's time." The older officer softened his tone. "Look, ma'am, let's just step aside and talk, okay? We don't want to escalate the situation." Escalate. That word hung in the air, as if she were the one moving things toward a tipping point. Camilla's eyes drifted to the people in line, some pretending not to watch. Others were clearly watching, their phones out and ready to capture the moment. It was predictable, really. A scene like this was practically guaranteed to go viral. Black woman detained at the airport check-in. Camilla could already picture the headlines flashing across screens. But she wasn't here for the limelight. Her mission was to stand firm in the truth. And in exactly 6 minutes, that truth would unfold. Taking a measured breath, she stepped forward, not toward the officers, but towards Susan. "You don't even know who I am," she said, her tone unwavering. Susan barely flinched. "I don't need to know," she replied coldly. "You were causing a disturbance." "Of disturbance?" Camilla let that word linger in the air. "I waited in line like any other customer. I spoke calmly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't break any rules. And yet, here we are." Susan's expression hardened. "I don't appreciate what you're suggesting." "I don't think I need to suggest anything," Camilla answered with a calm confidence. Your actions say everything loud and clear, Mark interjected with a scoff. Oh, come on. Are you seriously trying to turn this into a race issue? Camilla tilted her head, challenging him. I don't remember bringing up race, Mark. Fury crept across his face. He opened his mouth to retort, but the older officer raised his hand, sensing a need to steer clear of the escalating situation. Ma'am, he said cautiously, recognizing this was about to spiral out of control. Let's not complicate matters further. Camilla studied him for a moment, then offered a small, almost teasing smile. Complicate, she echoed, turning her gaze toward the terminal entrance. Minutes ticked by, the tension palpable. Susan clenched her arms tighter, while Mark fidgeted nervously. The younger officer, who had been quiet all this time, leaned in to whisper something to his partner, clearly feeling the weight of the situation. Meanwhile, Camilla stood composed, her hands clasped in front of her, radiating patience. What exactly do you think is about to happen? Susan pressed. Camilla smiled, but there was nothing warm about it. It was the kind of smile that hinted at impending upheaval. I think, she replied steadily, that you're about to realize just how grave a mistake you've made. Susan's eyes narrowed, but before she could retort, a ruckus erupted at the terminal entrance. A group of sharply dressed men and women marched in with intent, their presence instantly demanding attention. They acted without hesitation, moving in unison, resolute and focused. At the forefront was James Holloway, Chief Operating Officer of Skywings Airlines. His expression was a mask of controlled anger as he advanced toward them. The moment Mark caught sight of him, his previously confident demeanor wavered. Susan looked on, perplexed. Who are? Ms. Johnson? James's voice pierced through the terminal's clamor. Are you all right? A heavy silence followed. Susan blinked in surprise. Ms. Johnson? James disregarded her entirely, directing his full attention to Camilla. I arrived as soon as I received your call. Camilla nodded, maintaining her composure. You arrived promptly. James exhaled sharply, shaking his head in disbelief. He turned to the officers. What is happening here? The older officer appeared uncertain now. We received a report of a disturbance. James's jaw tightened. A disturbance? He gestured toward Camilla. Do you have any idea who this woman is? Mark and Susan tensed. A flicker of realization crossed Susan's face. James stepped closer. This is Camilla Johnson, CEO of Skywings Airlines. The color drained from Susan's complexion. Mark's mouth opened slightly, yet no words emerged. The younger officer raised his eyebrows, and even the older officer, who had remained composed, shifted uncomfortably. Camilla finally redirected her full attention to Susan. You mentioned calling security on me? Susan swallowed hard, her throat constricting. I didn't. But she had. Both had. And now, the weight of their actions was sinking in. Mark, still positioned behind the counter, appeared as if he wished to disappear. James crossed his arms, regarding them with evident disdain. You have embarrassed the owner of the company you represent. Do you understand how damaging this is? I was unaware. Susan stuttered. That is precisely the issue, Camilla replied smoothly. You had no idea. And yet, you acted as if I didn't belong here. You didn't even hesitate. You didn't bother to ask questions. You just made assumptions. Susan opened her mouth to respond, but words escaped her. The weight of silence hung heavily between them. Then Camilla turned to the officers. I assume I'm free to go? The older officer nodded firmly. Of course, ma'am. Camilla offered a polite smile. Thank you for your professionalism. In that moment, the dynamics shifted. She faced James again. I trust you'll manage this? James nodded. Consider it done. Susan's face drained of color. Wait. Both of them, James commanded, his tone sharp. Officers, now. Camilla didn't linger to listen to their protests. She had already spent too long dealing with people who never saw her potential. Susan Reynolds had dedicated years to climbing the corporate ladder. She took pride in her ability to manage people, control situations, and maintain authority. Yet, as she sat in a sterile conference room on the 18th floor of Skywings Airlines headquarters, her hands clasped tightly on the table, a chilling realization struck her. She wasn't in control anymore. Across from her, Mark Davidson sat, his usual arrogance replaced by visible anxiety. He hadn't spoken since they entered the room, his leg bouncing nervously beneath the table. Every few seconds, he let out a sharp exhale, rubbing his forehead, as if trying to shake off a nightmare. The door opened. Camilla Johnson stepped in without a word, her heels clicking softly against the floor. She neither slammed the door nor threw anything. She didn't need to raise her voice. James Holloway came in behind her, his expression unyielding. He dropped a folder onto the table, its contents spilling slightly. A thick stack of reports, complaints, and security footage stills lay on the table. "This," James said, tapping the folder, "is months of evidence pointing to discriminatory practices in our customer service department." His gaze was fixed on Susan. "Most of it leads back to you." Susan felt a sinking sensation in her stomach. "Wait, what?" she stammered. But James continued, ignoring her. He turned to Mark. "And you? 6 official complaints for racial profiling?" Mark's face turned a shade of crimson. "That's not—" Mark began, but James cut him off. "You've been reported for treating white customers with patience and courtesy while rushing or dismissing black and Latino passengers. We reviewed the airport security footage. The evidence is clear." Susan felt her heart race. Finally, Camilla spoke up. "You thought today's incident was isolated, didn't you? You assumed I was just some random person you could treat, however you liked." Susan opened her mouth to respond but closed it again. Mark's voice wavered. "I swear I didn't mean to," Camilla interrupted. "You didn't what? Not mean to be racist? Not mean to embarrass me? Or thought you wouldn't get caught?" A heavy silence settled in the room. Mark's jaw tightened, and for the first time, he couldn't meet her gaze. Camilla leaned closer, her expression unreadable. "Let me ask you something, Mark. If I were a white man in a business suit, would you have treated me the same way?" Mark remained silent, and deep down, he knew the answer. The quiet stretched for what felt like an eternity before Camilla finally leaned back in her chair. "I knew this was happening," she said, her voice steady but resonant with weight. "I've been reading the reports, listening to the complaints. I had to witness it firsthand." Susan frowned. "Wait, you set this up?" Camilla tilted her head. "Set up? No, Susan. Anticipated?" "Yes." Susan shook her head in disbelief. "So, this was a trap?" Camilla let out a quiet laugh, lacking any amusement. "A trap? No, Susan. A test. One that you failed miserably." Susan clenched the sides of the table. "I've been here for 10 years. I've managed teams and trained employees." "You trained them to act just like you," Camilla shot back, her tone sharp. "That's where the problem lies." Susan inhaled sharply, but Camilla pressed on. "Do you know what the biggest mistake people like you make?" she asked, her voice calm but with an undercurrent of certainty. "You believe power only belongs to those who look like you. You believe that those who don't align with your vision of success must somehow be lesser than you. You never consider that maybe, just maybe, they're observing you, waiting for the moment you reveal your true self." Susan's breath was heavy and uneven. Mark looked as if he wished he could fade away. James leaned in, flipping open a folder. "Here's where we stand. The company is initiating a complete internal investigation into discrimination in our customer service policies. Employees who have demonstrated consistent bias will be let go. This includes both of you." Susan's breath caught. "You're firing us?" James held her gaze firmly. "Yes," Mark let out a cynical laugh. "You can't possibly—" "I can," came the interruption from Camilla. "And I am." Mark turned to Susan, looking for support, but she was too stunned to react. Camilla took a deep breath and stood. "Effective immediately, you are both terminated." Your access to company systems has already been revoked, and security will escort you from the premises." Susan clenched her fists, her nails biting into her palms. "This is not fair." Camilla regarded her with a steady glare. "You want to discuss fairness?" She pointed toward the folder on the table. "Go ahead, Susan. Read about the people you've dismissed, overlooked, or ridiculed. The customers who were treated as though they were unworthy. The employees denied promotions simply because they didn't fit the so-called company culture." She shook her head. "No, Susan. What isn't fair is individuals like you determining who is worthy of respect and who is not." Mark pounded his fist on the table. "You're destroying my career over a misunderstanding." Camilla's gaze pierced through him. "No, Mark. You sealed your own fate the moment you chose to treat someone as lesser." A hush fell over the room. Finally, James stood up. "You have 15 minutes to pack your things." Susan looked at him, shaking her head in disbelief. "Camilla, please. I wasn't thinking." Camilla observed her for a long moment, then offered a small, almost sympathetic smile. "No, Susan, your thoughts were exactly as they've always been." She turned away from the door without a second glance. As she stepped outside, James followed, shutting the door behind them with a heavy sigh. That was tough. Camilla remained silent, her gaze fixed on the city below, where the streets thrived with energy. Eventually she spoke. It wasn't tough at all. She faced him, her expression a mystery. It was necessary. News spread like wildfire. By the time Camilla exited the boardroom and entered the executive wing of Skywings Airlines, the entire building was abuzz. Employees whispered in the hallways, casting her glances filled with newfound respect or, in some cases, barely concealed fear. Susan Reynolds and Mark Davidson were being escorted out by security, their faces stiff and movements mechanical, as if they were still grappling with how swiftly everything had unraveled. Camilla didn't focus on them. She had more pressing matters to attend to. James Holloway walked beside her, his brow drawn tight. "This will hit the press in a matter of hours." "I know," Camilla replied calmly. "People will claim we overreacted," he continued. "They'll say we made an example out of them." Camilla halted and turned to him. "James, do you honestly think we overreacted?" He answered without skipping a beat. "No." "Then let them talk." She adjusted her blazer cuff. "Skywings isn't here to protect poor employees. If anyone disagrees, they can easily find another airline." James exhaled, rubbing his hand over his face. "We need a statement." "I already wrote one," Camilla said matter-of-factly. Of course she had. She had anticipated this moment long before today. By that afternoon, the media was already picking up the story. Skywings Airlines released an official statement addressing the incident, emphasizing a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination within the company. Camilla's name appeared in every headline. Some labeled her ruthless. Others deemed her a visionary. But the title that spread fastest? The CEO who took 7 minutes to change everything. That evening, Camilla sat in her corner office, the glittering city skyline stretching through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Her phone buzzed. She glanced down to see a text from her father. "Saw the news. You did good, kid. Proud of you." A small smile crept across her face. Then another message arrived from a blocked number. Camilla clicked on it, feeling her jaw tighten as she read the ominous words. "You think you won?" "This isn't over." She let out a slow breath, locking her phone, with a sense of determination. No, this wasn't the end. In fact, it was just the beginning. The morning following the incident, Camilla Johnson woke to a world transformed. Her inbox was flooded with emails, executives, employees, reporters, and countless messages from unfamiliar names. Some were congratulatory, others were critical. Social media buzzed with fervent discussions. She went too far. She didn't go far enough. This is what leadership looks like. All she sought was attention. None of it caught her off guard. Shifts in power inevitably displace comfort. By midday, she stood back in the Skywings headquarters, facing a packed auditorium. Employees filled the seats, their gazes fixed on her as she approached the podium. Long speeches weren't her style, so she kept it straightforward. "What unfolded yesterday," she began, her voice steady, "was not just an incident. It was a symptom of a deeper silence. For too long, companies have ignored discrimination, letting it thrive beneath the surface. We try to convince ourselves it's merely bad apples or misunderstandings. But the truth? The truth is, we've built cultures, and those cultures don't simply happen. They're allowed to exist." She paused for effect. "Skywings will no longer tolerate this." A murmur passed through the audience. Some employees nodded in agreement, while others shifted uneasily in their seats. She pressed on. "Change isn't comfortable. It isn't easy. But it's vital. And if anyone here believes this company is better off maintaining the status quo..." She scanned the room intently. "There's the door." No one moved. "Good," she said firmly. "Now let's get to work." A week later, Camilla found herself in a quiet coffee shop, escaping the chaos of corporate meetings and media scrutiny. She sipped her espresso, savoring the bitterness that centered her. A shadow fell across her table. Looking up, she saw Mark Davidson. The usual arrogance was replaced by weariness. His eyes held exhaustion, and his shoulders sagged. He resembled a man who had been forced to face his own reflection as never before. "May I sit?" he asked. She watched him for a moment before motioning to the chair opposite her. Silence filled the air for a few seconds, and then Mark let out a sigh. "I wanted to say I'm sorry." Camilla stirred her coffee quietly. "Sorry for what?" His throat tightened as he swallowed. "For..." He hesitated, picking his words with care. "For jumping to conclusions. For overlooking you, for not grasping how deep this issue truly runs." She remained silent for a beat, finally placing her spoon down. "Do you grasp why you feel sorry?" Mark's eyes flickered, a silent struggle within him. He wished to say yes. He wished to convince her he understood it all, but he didn't. Not entirely. And Camilla had little patience for hollow words. She leaned in slightly. "This isn't just about me, Mark. It never has been. It's about every person who stood at that counter and was treated like they were less than others. It's about a system that allowed this to persist, again and again." Mark's gaze fell. "Do you genuinely want to change?" she asked. He nodded, slowly. She examined him, then she reached into her bag, took out a card, and slid it across the table. "Go talk to them," she said. Mark picked up the card, glancing at the name of an organization focused on corporate diversity and bias training. He looked back at her, surprised. "You're giving me a chance?" Camilla took a sip of her coffee. "I'm giving you a choice." He nodded again, tucking the card into his pocket. "Thank you," he muttered. She didn't reply. He stood there for a moment, contemplating saying something more, but then turned and left the cafe. Camilla watched him go. She wasn't sure if he would seize the opportunity or let it slip away. But that was the essence of change. It required a decision, and she had already made hers. She picked up her phone, scrolling through the ongoing emails, messages, and conversations. Then she typed a simple response to one of them. "Let's keep moving forward." And that's exactly what she did.